The night was colder than the men expected. The banks of the Rhine stretched out before them, dark and brooding, like a river that seemed less like water and more like a barrier drawn by fate itself. For months, the Americans had pushed across France, Belgium, and into Germany, step by bloody step. But now, with the Third Reich collapsing but still clawing at survival, they faced one last great obstacle, the mighty Rhine. German defenders had sworn to make it their grave. Sergeant Daniel Harper pulled his wool collar higher and kept his hands buried in his pockets. He wasn't a young boy anymore. At 39, with streaks of gray beginning to line his temples, he often felt older than most of the men around him. Many of the soldiers were barely 20, still with that restless energy that came before life truly weighed on a man's shoulders. Harper thought of his wife back in Kansas, her hands working the farm soil, her smile that carried him through the darkest trenches. He thought of the letter she had written just 2 weeks ago, about how the well had finally dried up, how she managed to get water from a neighbor, and how she prayed each night that God would bring him back. He folded that letter so many times it was wearing thin in his pocket, the words memorized by heart. The Rhine was swollen with spring rains, currents rushing strong, carrying debris and cold mist. The Germans had destroyed every bridge in their retreat, determined to turn the river into a fortress wall. Rumors swirled through the camps that crossing would be suicide, that the Wehrmacht and SS had lined the opposite banks with machine guns, artillery, and hidden nests. The soldiers whispered of impenetrable defenses and the last stand of the Reich. But Harper knew something most of them didn't. Not all obstacles are as strong as they appear, and sometimes the tools you carry are more powerful than anyone realizes. He had heard of them, the DUKWs. Soldiers called them ducks, though they looked ungainly at first glance. 6-wheeled trucks with boat-like hulls, designed to swim through rivers as easily as they rolled across dirt. To the Germans, they would be unimaginable. To the Americans, they would become wings over water. The night before the crossing, Harper walked past rows of ducks, their dark shapes looming in the shadows, tarps covering cargo and equipment. Engineers moved like ghosts, checking engines, sealing hatches, whispering last instructions. There was a silence about it all, not the usual chatter of men before a mission. This was bigger than any battle most of them had ever seen. To cross the Rhine was not just a maneuver, it was a statement. It was the breaking of a spell that had held Europe in chains for years. As dawn began to crack the horizon, a mist rolled across the water. Harper climbed into the duck with his squad, his boots clanging against the metal floor. The engine rumbled to life, a deep vibration under his hands. He looked at Private Jimmy Carter beside him, a kid from Ohio who had lied about his age to enlist. Jimmy grinned nervously, trying to mask his fear. "Ever think you'd ride a truck into a river?" he asked. Harper gave him a thin smile. "Son, after the last few years, I'd believe anything." The ducks rolled forward, wheels crunching gravel, then slipping seamlessly into the Rhine. The water slapped against the hull, the current pulling hard, but the engines pushed them steady. Harper could see the far bank through the mist, vague shapes of trees and maybe, just maybe, guns waiting. His heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't afraid of dying. Not anymore. But he was afraid of not making it back to the farm, of never holding his wife again, of leaving his son to grow up without his father's hand guiding him. Suddenly, the silence shattered. The German defenders opened fire. Machine gun rounds ripped across the water, snapping like angry hornets. Mortar shells whistled overhead and exploded in geysers that rocked the ducks. Men shouted, ducked low, clutched rifles and helmets. Harper grabbed Jimmy by the shoulder and shoved him down as bullets tore through the air where his head had been. The duck groaned but kept moving, churning forward through the chaos. And then, something happened the Germans hadn't expected. The ducks did not stop. They did not sink. They surged, one after another, dozens upon dozens, carrying men, jeeps, artillery, supplies. The river that was supposed to be impassable became a highway of steel and courage. German soldiers shouted from the banks, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had seen trucks. They had seen boats. But never trucks that became boats, carrying an army across the one barrier they thought could save them. Harper's duck reached the far shore. With a grinding roar, it climbed straight from water to mud, rolling onto German soil. His squad leapt out, rifles raised, charging forward. The surprise was total. German positions, once so confident, faltered under the sudden weight of American steel. Harper fired, ducked, advanced, his mind a blur of instinct and training. Jimmy was right behind him, eyes wide, firing like his life depended on it, because it did. The fight raged for hours. Villages near the banks shook with artillery. German tanks tried to counter, but with the Ducks landing anti-tank guns and armor almost instantly, the tide was impossible to stop. Harper's men pressed on, clearing houses, capturing bunkers. By nightfall, the Americans held a bridgehead across the Rhine. For the first time in history, the mighty river was breached by an invading army that refused to be denied. Later, as the men huddled in what had once been a German farmhouse, Harper sat with Jimmy by a broken fireplace. The boy's hands still trembled as he cleaned his rifle. Harper handed him a piece of bread from his ration, watched him chew slowly. "Scared today?" Harper asked softly. Jimmy nodded, ashamed. Harper leaned closer. "Good. Being scared means you value your life. Just don't let it stop you from living it." The boy met his eyes, and Harper saw something shift, like a spark catching flame. These were the lessons war carved into men. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to walk through it. Over the coming days, the Rhine crossing widened, turning into a flood of men and machines. Town after town fell, and the German defenders, once so certain of their strength, crumbled under the relentless push. Harper watched as prisoners lined up, hands raised, eyes hollow. He wondered how many of them had once believed they were invincible, protected by walls of stone, rivers of water, guns of steel. But no fortress is permanent. No wall stands forever. One night, Harper sat outside, looking at the stars above the shattered landscape. He thought about his farm, the quiet fields under the same stars, the sound of wind through wheat instead of artillery. He realized then that wars are not only won by weapons or machines. They are won by the faith that something better waits on the other side. The Ducks had been tools, yes, but it was the men inside them, their will to press on, that broke the spell of the Rhine. Years later, when Harper was home, long after the war had ended, he would tell his son about that crossing, not with details of blood or death, but with the lesson of the Ducks. He would say, "Son, life is full of rivers that look too wide, too strong, too dangerous. People will tell you it's impossible, that you can't cross. But if you have faith, if you trust the tools you've been given and the people beside you, you'll find a way. Just like we did at the Rhine." The boy would grow up hearing those stories, carrying them like armor. And Harper himself, when he walked his fields at dusk, would sometimes close his eyes and hear the roar of the Ducks again, feel the spray of the Rhine on his face, and remember how courage had carried him not just across a river, but through the darkest chapter of his life. For the Germans who stood on the banks that day, the sight of the Ducks was more than a surprise. It was the sound of inevitability. No wall could stop men who believed in something greater than themselves. For the Americans, it was proof that no obstacle, no matter how impossible it looked, was beyond their reach. And for men like Harper, it was the reminder that history is shaped not just by battles, but by choices. Choices to move forward when fear says stop, to believe when doubt says no, to cross rivers that were meant to keep you apart from everything you love. The Rhine was just water. The Ducks were just machines. But together, they became symbols of what human will can overcome. That night, as the smoke cleared and silence settled over the battlefield, Harper whispered a prayer, not for victory, not even for himself, but for the promise that his son would live in a world where rivers were not barriers, but paths forward. And in that prayer lived the truest lesson of all, that every impossible wall eventually crumbles, every storm eventually breaks, and every river, no matter how wide, can be crossed.